Good afternoon. Welcome to Markets Today. I'm your host, Bitha Mwema. Co-hosting the show with me is Mr. George Bordo. George, what's going on in your world?
Lots of things be there.
Yes.
We saw that the Interior Ministry has asked Safaricom to disable or suspend some certain pay bills, and specifically in regards to the betting farms.
Some interesting news there. But before we get into that,
and surprisingly,
yes,
SportPesa is in the list.
Wow. Hold on to very exciting. Hold on to that thought. Let's just get an overview of what's happening in the markets. 30 minutes to the close of the day. 463 million in turnover, slightly below what we saw yesterday. Of interest today is CFC Stanbic Bank. About 263 million in turnover has gone through there. We have a local buyer and the foreign seller in that name. The price was 100 shillings. We've talked to the traders on the desks and they're telling us they're seeing a bit of liquidity coming in from the local pension funds, especially as some of the bond papers begin to mature. So expect to see a bit more traction with regards to liquidity, especially on the banks over the next 2 to 3 weeks. That's what we have for now, but we will keep you updated after the end of the show with regards to highlights. Let's take it back to Safaricom and the betting companies, and 12 pay bills have been instructed to be shut down today.
That's massive.
SportPesa and betting. That's
massive.
They say the turnover for some of these companies combined is about
SportPesa does
billion.
about 80%.
80%
of the market.
If it's 200 billion in revenue, could you say that maybe half or slightly less than half goes through the Safaricom pay bill numbers?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah.
That's a huge sum, because the majority of the float has to go through the Safaricom platform, and then it gets held in the accounts that are related to these companies, correct?
Yeah.
So what's going to happen now? M-Pesa numbers, do we expect to see a dip in the revenue transactions that are happening there? Is it material? I think it's slightly material, but not too material.
I think for companies that are moving 200 billion shillings, it's actually a material figure for M-Pesa as a platform.
But I think they do 200 billion in terms of their revenue. I don't know, I don't have an exact overview of how much of that goes onto the platform, because also recall that Safaricom's total revenue from M-Pesa, from voice and from data is around that range, give or take. So I think maybe 100 billion potentially goes through the system.
I think it's a margin business for M-Pesa. They slice off a margin in terms of fees.
Yes.
They charge them small platform fees. But if you can imagine, if you're even charging a basis point on 200 billion shillings. And
it's the only distribution channel that's in use.
I mean, you could say 99% of these transactions are moving over M-Pesa. That's significant. I mean,
it's significant.
It's significant, and it would be interesting to have a discussion with the telco analysts to tell us if they're going to put a discount on the valuation models.
There's some analytical homework for us this night, to strip it down and see what percentage.
But it's something definitely to watch out.
Okay.
How far it goes.
Okay.
My feeling is that someone is probably it's a temporary issue. I think it's probably a temporary. I mean, some of these guys are very, very big. I believe it from where I sit.
Regulatory risk.
It could actually be a temporary issue, but certainly this is a regulatory risk crystallizing right there.
George, we keep saying with Safaricom, the operational environment, it's okay. When you look at their business model, whether they're efficient or not, they're running a very good business, a tight ship. The issue is always regulatory risk, which is external to them. So this is one element. Then there's the other element that we keep having a discussion and wondering whether the M-Pesa will be split from the voice. But today the MPs have actually come and said they've opposed that bit of legislation.
No, actually it's not an MP, it's the regulators.
It's the regulators.
It's the Minister of ICTs, the Minister of ICT, the Central Bank, and the Communications Authority.
And that's a very strong voice, and it's a very strong consortium of regulators, which in a way tells me not to bother about that bit of regulation, at least for now.
But we need to understand that the legislative process, the input of key stakeholders like the Minister of ICT, the Central Bank of Kenya, the Communication Authority, even the Competition Authority, their input goes into the legislative process. However, the legislature can still decide to ignore some of their concerns. But and we've seen that before play out before.
On that actually, you see what happens on the legislative, I know for a fact, if a ministry actually sponsors legislation, so for instance, if it's the telecommunication sector, Ministry of ICT sponsors any draft to the regulation, it actually bears more weight, and the way the bill goes in draft, you actually expect it to sail through without any repercussions. If you actually have an external sponsor, which was the case for the split of Safaricom M-Pesa from the voice business, then it actually has a lesser probability of passing in its actual state.
Actually, if the ministry sponsors a bill on any other stakeholder,
more or less
it's actually external. Actually, bills are supposed to originate from Parliament because Parliament is the only legislative body.
George, they originate
Yes.
from Parliament,
Yes.
but the stakeholders. So you
Yeah.
can have a private member's bill,
Yeah.
which is, I think, what we were talking about, the proposal to split, or you can have the ministry, which has to execute the mandate of the executive office. So, for instance, the Vision 2030 says we need to use technology as an enabler.
Yeah.
So then the Ministry of ICT has the mandate from the executive to break it down and say, what does technology as an enabler mean? For instance, we need fiber to the home, we need access, lower MTR rates, etc. So they draft a regulation which they take to Parliament.
Yeah.
When that regulation goes in that form, it actually has a higher chance of succeeding in the
that's
way
true.
it is.
Yeah.
Then Safaricom, which is a private sector, gets in.
Yeah, but the point here is that we've seen it before play out, that Parliament can actually ignore stakeholders.
Ministry of ICT is what I'm backing on. If
Yes.
I actually had anything advanced from Ministry of ICT,
Yeah.
if you track from
And we
when
saw this with
the
the-
Analysis Mason report came through,
Yeah.
the Ministry of ICT has been going a step ahead, and it has actually been having more influence in terms of whether this report is tabled, whether the dominance conversation happens. And in fact, on this conversation, I'd be more interested on Ministry of ICT vis-a-vis the Communication Authority,
Okay.
whose mandate was, I think, actually
Let's wait and see.
undermined. But let's wait and
Let's
see.
wait and see,
I'm
I
on
think,
Ministry
but
of ICT
I mean,
side.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
We saw this with the Banking Amendment Act, where Parliament literally ignored Minister of Finance.
But where was KBA in all of this?
Yeah, well, it's debatable. It's debatable.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But then also speaking on sticking to digital lending, yesterday the CBK governor was in Parliament presenting his findings with regards to whether regulation is important for this part of the economy where the mobile lenders are actually getting into that space and they're not regulated by CBK.
Yeah.
His proposal, he says it's a very hard business to control. There's an element of corruption. There's an element of they cannot control and source where these funds are coming from. So KYC, anti-money laundering concerns are there. And he's proposing strongly that regulation is needed in that space. Names that came up, those Tala and those Branch
I think
and
he's right.
Okash.
I think he's right. It's time we regulate digital lenders in Kenya. I think this is the second time that the Central Bank of Kenya governor is actually urgently calling for regulation of this platform. Well, in the first call that he made,
Yes.
the digital lenders came up, formed an umbrella body calling themselves Digital Lenders Association of Kenya. Well,
Trying
12
to
of them
preempt the
came together.
process.
I think it's all moved to preempt a potential prudential regulatory framework for them. But I think the Central Bank has taken up this case so seriously. Parliament is listening. I think it's time. I think it's time that we regulated these guys. In my view, it's time. But I just don't know how regulation will look like.
Or maybe they just sign
Yeah.
SPVs with the banks that don't have a
my
presence
sense
in
is
that space.
In early 2018, the National Treasury sponsored a bill which was calling the Financial Markets Conduct Bill 2018, which had very robust proposals on how to regulate credit-only institutions. I think it's time we go back to the shelf, pick up that bill, bring it back.
George, an opportunity for the banks that don't already have a huge presence with regards to digital banking, because if you have the non-banks being regulated, then the banks have an opportunity to actually aggressively get into that space.
Yeah,
and
I don't
tap
think
into
some
the
of those,
market.
and the central bank governor was very right.
Yes.
He's very concerned about the funding of some of these platforms.
Exactly.
He was actually almost saying that these guys could actually be an avenue for illicit financial flows getting with the former channels.
Anti-money
very
laundering
concerned.
is a
It's
big...
time to look at this.
It's
and I don't think that the platforms can survive regulation.
That's a big issue right there. So you have it. A lot of things that are happening there with regards to regulatory risk. One thing is telecoms, the issue of the betting companies. 12 companies have been asked to be switched off with regards to the pay bill from Safaricom. We're still waiting to see the potential impact on the revenues of Safaricom. Then there's also the element of upcoming regulation on digital lending. But let's switch up this conversation. We want to look at the real estate. Are you in the money? Are you out of the money? What happened in the first half of 2019? To help us with that conversation, we have Beatrice Mwangi, who's a real estate investment analyst at Cyton. We take a break to look at the digital commodities, and we will be back. Don't go anywhere.